In 1895, a woman crossing Broadway at 14th Street sank up to her knees in mud. She couldn't free herself. A passing cart driver had to pull her out with a rope. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. We've explored the hidden rooms inside New York's buildings, the secret apartments, the forgotten tunnels. But now, let's step outside, onto the streets themselves. Because before the concrete, before the asphalt, before the city we recognize today, New York's streets were something closer to a swamp. 2.5 million people lived in Manhattan in the 1890s. They shared their roads with over 150,000 horses. And those horses produced something the city couldn't escape: 3 million pounds of manure. Every single day. This is the story of New York before pavement, when crossing the street was an act of survival, when the ground beneath your feet could swallow your shoes, and when the city's greatest engineering challenge wasn't building up, it was simply creating solid ground to stand on. Manhattan wasn't built for what it became. The island's original terrain was a mix of rocky outcrops, marshland, streams, and hills. The Lenape people who lived there for thousands of years followed paths that worked with this landscape. They didn't try to impose a grid on geography that resisted straight lines. European settlers had different ideas. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 imposed a rigid street grid on Manhattan, 12 avenues running north to south, 155 cross streets running east to west. The plan ignored topography completely. Hills would be leveled, streams would be buried, marshes would be filled. But filling a marsh doesn't make it solid ground. It makes it mud with ambition. By the 1890s, many of Manhattan's streets sat on land that had been swamp within living memory. The fill material varied wildly: construction debris, garbage, ash, whatever was available. When it rained, this patchwork foundation turned to soup. The problem was worst in Lower Manhattan, where the original shoreline had been extended block by block into the East River and the Hudson River. Water Street was named for what it used to border. By 1890, it sat 3 blocks from the actual waterfront, built on landfill that never fully stabilized. To understand New York's mud problem, you have to understand the horse economy. In 1890, horses powered everything. They pulled streetcars, delivery wagons, private carriages, and omnibuses. They hauled freight from the docks. They carried the fire department to emergencies. They transported the dead to cemeteries. The city's horse population peaked at around 175,000 animals in the 1880s. Each horse produced between 15 and 30 pounds of manure per day. Do the math. That's somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million pounds of waste hitting the streets every 24 hours. And manure wasn't the only output. Horses urinated constantly, each animal producing gallons of liquid waste daily. They shed hair. They lost shoes. And when they died, which happened frequently, given the brutal working conditions, their carcasses had to be removed. In 1880, the city recorded over 15,000 dead horses on its streets. That's more than 40 per day. The bodies often lay where they fell for hours or days before removal crews arrived. All of this mixed with the unpaved or poorly paved streets. Rain turned the mixture into a thick, brown slurry. Dry weather baked it into dust that coated everything, lungs included. There was no good weather for New York's streets, only different varieties of bad. Getting from one side of a street to the other was a genuine challenge. Wealthy women wore long skirts that dragged on the ground. Fashion demanded it. But fashion didn't account for streets covered in horse waste and mud. A single crossing could ruin a dress that cost more than a factory worker's monthly wage. The solution was the crossing sweeper. These were typically boys, some as young as 6 or 7, who staked out busy intersections and swept paths through the muck for pedestrians. A customer would signal. The sweeper would clear a route, and a small tip would change hands. It was entrepreneurship born of desperation. The boys earned pennies, but pennies added up, and the alternative was often worse. For those who couldn't afford tips or didn't want to wait, there were stepping stones, large flat rocks placed at intervals across the street. Pedestrians hopped from stone to stone, trying to keep their feet above the worst of the mud. The stones sank constantly and had to be reset. Some intersections had raised wooden crosswalks. These helped, but they rotted quickly in the wet conditions and became slippery hazards in rain or snow. The fundamental problem remained. New York's streets weren't designed for pedestrians. They were designed for commerce. People on foot were an afterthought. Historical accounts consistently mention the smell. One visitor from London described Manhattan's summer streets as an open sewer crossed with a stable. A newspaper editorial from 1892 complained that certain blocks near the waterfront were unfit for human passage. Horse manure was the primary contributor, but garbage rotted in gutters. Slaughterhouses and tanneries operated within city limits. Summer heat accelerated decomposition. The smell rose from the streets in waves. Wealthy New Yorkers fled to the countryside during July and August. Those who couldn't leave closed windows despite the heat and held handkerchiefs to their faces. The conditions weren't just unpleasant, they were deadly. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. These diseases thrived where waste contaminated water supplies. New York experienced major cholera outbreaks in 1832, 1849, and 1866. The 1866 outbreak killed over 1,200 people. The Metropolitan Board of Health, established that same year, gained powers to regulate sanitation. But progress was slow. Property owners resisted requirements. Tammany Hall prioritized patronage over public health. Children suffered most. Infant mortality in the poorest neighborhoods exceeded 250 deaths per 1,000 live births. 1 in 4 babies didn't survive their first year. New York's leaders knew the streets needed improvement. They just couldn't agree on how. The city experimented with multiple paving materials throughout the 19th century. Each had advocates. Each had problems. Cobblestones were durable, but created a bone-jarring ride for carriages and wagons. The gaps between stones collected filth that was nearly impossible to clean. Horses slipped on wet cobblestones, often breaking legs that meant death sentences. Wooden blocks seemed promising. They were quieter than stone and easier on horses' hooves. Several major streets were paved with wooden blocks in the 1860s and 70s. But wood absorbed moisture, manure, and urine. It rotted. It became slippery. In dry conditions, it was a fire hazard. After a few years, wooden pavements often became worse than the mud they replaced. Granite blocks were expensive, but long-lasting. They became the standard for major commercial streets. But the cost limited their use to high-traffic areas. Side streets and residential neighborhoods remained unpaved or poorly paved. Asphalt appeared in the 1870s. It was smooth, relatively quiet, and easier to clean than alternatives. But early asphalt formulations softened in summer heat. Horses' hooves punched holes in it. Wagon wheels left ruts. The technology needed decades of refinement before it became reliable. The result was a patchwork city. One block might have granite. The next might have rotting wood. The next might have nothing but packed earth that turned to mud with every rain. The transformation began with a man named George Waring. Waring was a Civil War veteran, an agricultural engineer, and an obsessive believer in sanitation. In 1895, the Reform Mayor William Strong appointed him Street Cleaning Commissioner. It was a patronage position that previous holders had treated as a sinecure. Waring treated it as a crusade. He inherited a department of demoralized workers, broken equipment, and institutionalized corruption. Previous commissioners had allowed employees to skip work, sell city property, and ignore entire neighborhoods. The streets showed the results. Waring fired the incompetent and the corrupt. He reorganized the department along military lines. He insisted on being called colonel. He designed new uniforms, all white, to show dirt and enforce cleanliness. His workers became known as the White Wings. The visual transformation was immediate. Suddenly, New York had a visible, uniformed sanitation force. The White Wings swept streets, collected garbage, and removed snow with an efficiency the city had never seen. Waring introduced systematic approaches that seem obvious today, but were revolutionary then. He divided the city into districts with assigned crews. He established regular collection schedules. He created the first large-scale recycling program in American history, separating organic waste, ash, and rubbish for different processing. Within 2 years, death rates from street filth-related diseases dropped measurably. The connection between clean streets and public health became undeniable. Even as Waring cleaned the streets, the source of the problem was beginning to disappear. Electric streetcars replaced horse-drawn cars starting in the 1880s. By 1895, most of Manhattan's streetcar lines had converted to electric power. Each conversion removed dozens of horses from the streets. The automobile arrived in the late 1890s. Early cars were expensive, unreliable, and viewed as toys for the wealthy. But their potential was clear. A machine that didn't produce manure, didn't die in the streets, and didn't require feeding represented an obvious improvement over the horse. The transition took decades. Horses remained common on New York streets into the 1920s. Delivery wagons, in particular, continued using horsepower long after passenger vehicles had switched to motors. But the peak had passed. The 175,000 horses of the 1880s declined to under 50,000 by 1910. The manure problem that had seemed unsolvable was solving itself through technological change. The automobile brought its own problems, of course. Exhaust fumes replaced manure smell. Traffic accidents replaced horse-related injuries. Noise pollution changed character, but didn't diminish. Still, the streets became passable in ways they hadn't been before. The mud era was ending. The early 20th century brought systematic street improvement. Asphalt technology matured. New formulations resisted heat and traffic better than earlier versions. The material became standard for residential streets throughout the city. Concrete appeared for sidewalks and heavy traffic areas. It was more expensive than asphalt, but more durable. The combination of concrete sidewalks and asphalt roadways became the template that most American cities still follow. Underground infrastructure expanded simultaneously. Storm sewers carried rainwater away instead of letting it pool on streets. Sanitary sewers removed human waste that had previously contaminated groundwater. Water mains brought clean water to replace contaminated wells. By 1920, Manhattan's streets were recognizably modern. Paved surfaces, underground utilities, electric lights, motor vehicles. The mud city of the 1890s had become the concrete city of the 20th century. The transformation happened within a single generation. Someone born in 1880 could remember streets that swallowed shoes and smell that drove people indoors. By the time they reached middle age, those same streets were paved, cleaned, and lit. The mud era reveals something important about cities. They're not natural, they're constructed. And construction is never finished. We walk on New York's sidewalks today and assume they've always been there. They haven't. Every block of pavement represents a decision, an investment, a political battle. Someone had to fight for that concrete. The 1890s New Yorkers who waded through mud weren't less intelligent or less capable than we are. They faced constraints we don't face. Technological, financial, political. They did what they could with what they had, and they built the foundation for what came after. The sewer systems installed in the 1880s still function today. The street grid they paved still carries traffic. The public health institutions they created still protect us. The mud is gone, but the city it became still stands on the decisions made when the streets were rivers of filth and crossing Broadway was an adventure. 3 million pounds of manure per day. That was the problem. And somehow, the city solved it. The concrete beneath your feet is a victory. Hard won, easily forgotten. Thank you for watching. Next time, we cross the Atlantic to a city that faced its own battle against filth, fog, and chaos. London rebuilt itself from the ashes, but the cost was higher than anyone expected.